Wall Street Journal. And I was struck by the enormous opportunity and potential in Egypt, but also the difficulties in achieving the level of economic development that Egypt needed. There was a very large state-run sector. Access to capital was often complicated. One sensed enormous human capital, smart young men and women coming out of Egyptian universities and technical schools, but not always a way to use that human capital creatively. So I've been watching that story now for 30 years, going back to 1980. And so this morning's subject is one of longstanding interest for me. We're going to be talking this morning about economic issues in Egypt. That's not to say there aren't other important issues involving politics, human rights, all the different range of issues. But this morning we're going to talk about the Egyptian economy and some innovative new ways of building businesses in Egypt that have been encouraged by the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, which is the child, if you will, of the person who's going to be our co-host today, Jim Harmon. I first met Jim Harmon in the mid-1990s when he was head of the Export-Import Bank in Washington. I had just been business editor of the Washington Post and was becoming a columnist. And Jim and I began talking about complicated economic development issues around the world and innovative ways that might be possible to provide capital, to provide sponsorship, encouragement for innovation in the emerging markets, frontier markets around the world. That's become Jim's a great source of expertise. I don't know an American who understands these frontier markets better than Jim Harmon. So with that brief introduction, I'd like to turn this over to Jim for a few minutes of introduction from him about these enterprise funds in Egypt and elsewhere. And then we're going to turn for a conversation with two of Egypt's leading entrepreneurs, Ashraf Sabry, the CEO of Fawry, and Magda Habib, who's the CEO of Dawi Clinic. I'll be talking to them about how they built their businesses. And then Jim and I will come back at the end. If you'd like to ask questions, please go to the Q&A function that you'll see on your Zoom screen. I'm sure you're all familiar with this technology, and type those in, and I'll try to look at them and select a few that I think might be of interest to our viewers. So with that, let me turn this over to Jim Harmon, who was the founder, and I want to say the godfather of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. Jim.
Thank you very much, David. The large number of registered attendees today, in excess of 400, reflects a number of factors. A growing U.S. interest to invest in Egypt, maybe a little curiosity about the success of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund, but most of all about our guests. 9 years ago, almost to the day, the U.S. Congress passed legislation to authorize the establishment of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund to help the private sector in Egypt regain its footing and grow following the Arab Spring. A month later, in January of 2012, the White House asked me to chair the fund, which would have $300 million to invest in Egypt. I was attracted to the challenge because I viewed it to be a bipartisan program. Most of you know we do not have too many bipartisan agreements here in Washington these days, but Republicans had created enterprise funds back in the early 1990s to support Eastern European countries, including former Soviet Union countries, to transition from communism to open free markets. Those programs were moderately successful, but no enterprise fund had ever been launched in a country amid a revolution. That would be a challenge for me. I am pleased that we have now invested more than $200 million and committed most of the remaining money that Congress authorized for us. The market value of the fund today exceeds $550 million. I'll just say that again for my friends, $550 million, which means we have a gain of $250 million, almost all of it in the form of marketable, publicly traded shares. For the record, neither I nor any U.S. director participate in any part of the profits, nor have I received any consideration for the 9 years of work. In addition, we have attracted more than 400 million in foreign capital to Egypt. Our first investment was Fawry. Not a bad start. As you know, Fawry is Egypt's largest e-payment platform and a very successful company. We will hear from Ashraf Sabry shortly. We have seeded 2 first-time fund managers, one of whom has now closed their first independent private equity fund. To my knowledge, this is the only private equity closing in Africa this year. We have created more than 3,000 jobs. Take a look at our impact report on our website. We are very proud of our development work, as we are of the financial returns. Credit goes to the talent in Egypt who found, negotiated, and managed the investments. Credit goes to the US Congress who had the wisdom to establish the fund, and to USAID who have helped us organize and administer the fund. We don't always give credit to the government, but this time I feel strongly that they did a very smart thing in creating the enterprise fund and in administrating and helping us to do the work. The fact that the enterprise fund was originated under a Republican president, Bush I, in 1990, and 20 years later, President Obama and Secretary Clinton had the vision to move enterprise funds to the next level, is what we call a form of bipartisanship. That the Trump administration allowed us to continue our work was another indication that the US government, under either party, wanted to support Egypt, our critical friend and ally in Africa. Now I just want to make a few comments about the future. I expect to see the launch of more enterprise funds joining private sector impact investment funds, reducing the amount of funds needed from Congress in the future. This will leverage taxpayer funds, and the private sector will bring technology, expertise, and environmental sustainability to a greener frontier and developing countries. I believe Egypt will attract significant capital from investors in the United States and Europe. I am bullish on Egypt. If a small team in Cairo and a few of us in New York could produce returns of 20% per annum over the last 5 years, can you imagine the returns from private equity funds in Cairo over the next decade? Lastly, I expect other countries to launch their own enterprise funds. The beneficiaries will be the developing and frontier world, reducing poverty. And for the United States, this may be part of the answer to how we compete with China. So thanks. I'll turn this back to David.
So I thank Jim for that introduction. Jim and I will be back at the end of our webinar to have more discussion about some of the issues that have been raised by the enterprise fund experience in Egypt and elsewhere. For right now, I'd like to ask our 2 Egyptian entrepreneurs, Ashraf Sabry and Magda Habib, to join me on the screen to talk a little bit about the success stories of their companies and how they built their companies. Ashraf, let me start with you. You're, as Jim said, the first investment that the enterprise fund made was in Fawry, and today, last I looked, you were a $1 billion company in market cap. Your company Fawry has been described as Egypt's first unicorn, which is a nice thing for folks to say about you. Talk us through the story about the opportunity in the market that you saw for the kind of e-payments company that you built. And then we'll talk about some of the questions and competitive issues that you faced along the way.
Well, number one, thank you for the invitation. I mean, it's always good to be part of a panel speaking about investment opportunities in the Egyptian market. And I would like to start, the story by saying that Magda Habib, who is the CEO of Dawi, was one of the co-founders of Fawry as well. So it was a journey that started early enough in 2008. At that point of time, we had institutional shareholders, actually. I mean, we had HSBC Bank and a couple of Egyptian banks, another technology fund. So, I mean, we were born institutional rather than being born as a VC and a startup and all the stuff. So this is where the foundation, where the company started. The objective of the company is as reflected in its logo, which is making the life of Egyptians easier. So the logo is very simple. Fawry means immediate, and our sub logo is convenience, easier. So what we really have managed to do is that we have solved the problem of many people by making their payments and fulfilling their payment needs in an easy way. So I think this was the core of the story. And it was serving banked people and unbanked people. So, we had a large network serving people across the entire country, regardless of they are banked or unbanked. And then, things developed until I believe it was 2013, when IFC came in as an investor in the company as well. And I have to say that having IFC with the company was a really good eye-opener, because IFC had investments in similar companies around the world. And I have to give the credit to IFCians if this is where they managed actually to have forums collecting payment companies from around the world every single year to have these discussions and original investors to exit, and then we had new investors coming in. So we had Helios from the UK, we have EFG Hermes from Egypt, and we have the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund with different stakeholders. And then the company continues to grow, whereby now, as a network, we are serving more than 30 million Egyptian people in the entire country. And we are actually serving around 160,000 small businesses to develop their business. And we are experiencing something like 3 million transactions a day. And we are, so things started to grow. We diversified into other lines of businesses, all around capturing the future of the new generation. I think the driver of the company right now and at any point of time is that we are, you have to know that in Egypt, 45 million Egyptians are using Facebook. Approximately the same number is using WhatsApp. On the other hand, they are digitally connected to the internet to access those services. We have, the penetration of the mobile is above 80%. Smartphone penetration is above 50%. All of these factors together is actually telling us that consumers will behave differently in the future. And what we are doing now is that we are actually trying to capture the way the consumers will behave in the future digitally and facilitate this for the enterprise, for the government, and for the consumer. So this is in a nutshell, the purpose of the company and where we are heading and what value we are creating to the entire ecosystem.
Ashraf, let me ask you a follow-up question, which I'm sure is of special interest to our financial market friends on this webinar. Your platform, more broadly, e-commerce related space is increasingly competitive. Looking at the number of companies in Egypt that are trying to play a role, that number obviously is growing. And I look at the Chinese giants of electronic payments, Alipay, WeChat has its own payment function. And I wonder if people are looking at your Egyptian market and trying to come in and take away some of that future growth. And so my question to you simply is, how do you plan in managing Fawry to continue to offer a product that's strong enough to hold and expand its market share?
Well, I think by being ahead all the time, there is a very important factor is that all our offerings are being developed. We develop our technology. So we have our technology owned by the company. We have a very strong brand. The technology helps us to accommodate to the ever-changing needs in the market. And I think even if competitors from around the world will decide to come to the Egyptian market, they will look for really large players who have a dominant market share and find ways to cooperate with. Because otherwise, those companies, when they go to other markets, they go to expand their market share, not to start from scratch. And I think, we have been in discussions with many international payment gateways. We have developed interfaces with them, and we cooperate rather than compete, because the last mile and the local knowledge and the understanding of the consumer behavior and all this stuff is something that you develop with time. You cannot come and capture it in a second. So, to the contrary, I think this is an opportunity for more cooperation and for providing the market with more advanced services in cooperation with international competition.
And let me ask you one more question before I turn to Magda, Habib, and that is, what are the obstacles to the level of growth that might be possible, either in terms of your technology platform, your human capital, financial capital? What are the things that you as a CEO in this dynamic but still somewhat fragile market situation think about and hope to see solved and improved going forward?
Actually, all what you have addressed are always issues that we have to manage, whether it is the human capital. However, I have to say that the entire technology have been developed by Egyptian talent, and there is access to Egyptian talent in the market. This does not mean that there are no challenges, but at least we can source Egyptian talent from the market. I think managing growth is the real challenge, and managing introducing new services all the time. Managing the relation with the regulator, I think is a very important issue, because you are coming with new technologies, with new ideas, and you need to have this relation established with the regulator to make them aware of what you are doing. Having a network effect in an ecosystem where you are connecting different players that would create more value by making those connections. So there are many factors that are in the development phase, but I think the most important thing in all reality is how you can manage growth. Access to finance, I think, with the gross opportunities and the returns that happened in the Egyptian market, I think access to finance is not a major issue. I think managing the growth is really what we are catering for, or what is in the top of our priorities. Plus, this is a very fast-changing environment, and you have to disrupt yourself. If you don't disrupt yourself, maybe somebody will disrupt you. So, having the internal stamina and the DNA of the organization that we have something new and that we are developing new products and we are disrupting ourselves in what we do is very important for the continuity and the growth of the business. So I think those are the main factors that we should look at any single point of time.
I should ask you before I turn to Magda, since you mentioned disruption and new ideas, I need to ask you, what disruptions or new ideas, products, and services are you thinking about?
I will tell you, I have visited Brazil and I have visited China and I have visited India, and I am seeing there, actually, especially in China, you mentioned Alipay and you mentioned WeChat Pay and you mentioned, and I think, there are lots of opportunities of changing the behavior. We believe that the mobile as a platform is the future, okay? And when I say the mobile as a platform, I don't mean the mobile as a payment option. No, I mean the mobile as a platform, where you are going to find all the services you want to render, where you are going to buy what you're looking for, where you are going to look for financial services. I think people will be highly engaged on the mobile platform, and the more you are, and I have to tell you, we are offering our mobile platform as a service probably to the entire ecosystem in the Egyptian market. We invested a lot since 2013 in developing our capabilities in this area. So engaging with customers on the mobile to fulfill variety of
So thank you, Ashraf, and we'll come back to you. I'm seeing now almost a dozen questions from our audience. Please keep sending them in, and we'll try to ask your questions of our guests a bit later. Let me now turn to Magda Habib, the CEO, the founder of Dawi Clinics. This illustrates the wonderful virtuous cycle of economic development that, as Ashraf said, Magda started with him at Fawry and then wanted to launch her own business. I read, Magda, that you want people to think of Dawi as the Starbucks of clinics, which is an ambitious idea. Why don't you just tell the audience a little bit about the basic idea for Dawi Clinics, how you've been building the business, and what you see on the competitive horizon in terms of future growth.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thank you, James, for having me on this panel. And yes, as Ashraf said, I was working with Ashraf in Fawry since its inception, and in 2015, I left with the first exit. And I was thinking of different businesses that I could start up, and healthcare is not my background. But as you said, the idea of a Starbucks chain of clinics was what inspired me to get into this business. Because the market in Egypt, if I take a minute to explain the healthcare market in Egypt, Egypt is a very populous nation with 100 million people, not very rich. Poverty rates are high. We have a huge public sector healthcare services that provide suboptimal services to many. And then we have a very, very fragmented private sector offering. There is some consolidation play that is happening now in the tertiary market, in the hospitals, and in the diagnostic market. But in the private outpatient clinic service, it is extremely fragmented. There is no standard service. People, when you talk to consumers, they are at a loss to choose which doctors to go to. The concept of a family clinic, where a family has a complete health record and a continuous long-term relationship with a certain physician or a clinic, is not very available in the market. And that causes a lot of inconveniences as well as a lot of compromises on the health outcomes of the families. So it was obvious to me that there is room for innovation in the outpatient space specifically, to establish a retail chain of clinics that is standardized, that is scalable, where the quality of service is driven by guidelines and the doctors are part of an organization and a structured delivery mechanism. So therefore, the similarity with Starbucks, that was an inspiration, and that's how we started the business. We started, my partner is a physician. I'm not a physician by training, but my partner, Dr. Maya Rosdos, she is a physician. And together we started Dawi clinics in 2018. We were raising funds right before the Egyptian pound devaluation, which was a very difficult time to raise funds. But fortunately, we tapped into some local liquidity trapped that period in Egypt. And not like Fawry, I was not able to start with an institutional investor base. So I started with a few high net worth individuals back then. By 2018, we had, we had opened 4 branches across Cairo. The traction was clear. People were appreciating the modern, clean, basic clinics that we opened, that we are positioned very much on families, urban families of medium income. We offer a holistic service to the entire family. So we have dentistry, we have internal medicine, we have lab tests, we have pediatricians, we have everything that the Egyptian family would need in terms of outpatient medical care on a day-to-day basis. And then in 2018, towards the end, we started talks with the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund. They were the first institutional investor that came on board in early 2019. And with the funds they helped us with, we grew now to 12 outlets across Cairo, and we have started venturing out of Cairo. We have 2 locations now in Delta, which is the northern part of Egypt. And as I said, our ambition and the opportunity we see is to disrupt the delivery of outpatient services by being a nationwide network of standardized, consistent, affordable medical service to the Egyptian families.
Let me ask you about the particular market niche that you described. Egypt has a vast national system of healthcare that's free as a base for the population as a whole. And then for wealthy individuals, there's always been access to international standards of care, either in Egypt or outside the country. And you seem to be targeting the space in between, as you said, the middle class consumer. And I just want to ask whether there are problems above and below in a country like Egypt, where public welfare just really is seen as an absolute right and obligation of the government. Do you run into difficulty in that sense? And is the proposition that you're offering basically that you will provide a level of service that simply isn't available through the free national system in terms of preventive care, diagnostics? What's the proposition you're offering to your consumers?
You're absolutely right, David. The market in Egypt is, first, it's a changing landscape. So I will tell you where we are and where the market is heading. So you are right, there is high-end private healthcare providers that are quite expensive, and only a very small percentage of the population that can afford that. If we talk health insurance in Egypt, there is some very limited penetration of private health insurers, but there is the government-sponsored health insurance program that offers free medical health care to a large portion of the population. This is mainly targeted to the poor tranche, which is a significant proportion of the Egyptian population. So about 40% of the people that are really in the CND or DNE actually segments will be going to public hospitals and consuming those private services. There is also some distortion in the low end of the market because there are, in addition to the free government services, there are a lot of charitable organizations attached to mosques and to churches and to NGOs that will offer subsidized service. So this very low end of the market is very difficult to penetrate in terms of a profit-generating business. But the medium segment, the segment that is comprised of hardworking families that are either self-employed or employees of corporations, that will not go to the charity organizations or the free healthcare, and at the same time cannot afford the top high-level private, small niche private service providers. They are stuck in between. And that is the opportunity we identified. There are a lot of available service, but nothing that is standardized, that is following international guidelines, that is auditable, that is all computerized. So all our doctors will have the electronic medical records completely on the computer. If you go to any branch of the Fawry chain, you will have your your medical record available to the doctors. So it's also a different experience, not only for the patients, but for the physicians. Because the physicians in Egypt, they find it very difficult to build their own practices. It takes a long time. There aren't many organizations for them to join where the administrative and operational part of the business is taken care of and where they can focus on the professional delivery of medicine. So our stakeholders are not only the patients, but also the physicians. They are a major partner of the business, and the different models of engagement with them is part of the innovative approach we are coming to the market with.
Magda, let me ask you about the opportunities presented by telemedicine, both within Egypt and also internationally. I'm sure you've thought a lot about this. Tell us how extensive the use of telemedicine is now in your company, and as you look forward over the next 5+ years, how you see the growth in the use of telemedicine services.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, telemedicine has been the buzzword now since the COVID crisis started, because clearly that creates an opportunity. And there's a very simplistic way of talking about telemedicine, which is doctor and patient interacting over some live chat or interface. And that, of course, is happening a lot in Egypt now. We have launched our, since the COVID crisis began in Egypt back in March, we have launched a free telehealth support line for COVID patients. We've done that because we felt it was our obligation to society at that point. And it's a 24-hour support line where you can talk to a physician and have your tests reviewed and be advised on treatment courses for COVID. But that is only the tip of the iceberg, because physician-patient interaction cannot be entirely consummated over remote chat. Inevitably, you need to be examined, procedures need to be administered. So I believe that telemedicine is an excellent complement to a more comprehensive delivery network. And we are now integrating our telehealth offering into our basic offering. So you don't have to meet the physician every single time. Sometimes the physical examination is needed, other times it is not. But it's not just the examination, there are other things that you can do with telemedicine. So for example, we have different levels of physicians. If a certain physician wants to take the advice of a more senior consultant for a specific case, he can share the x-rays and the lab tests remotely and take that additional consultation either himself or pass it on to the patient. So telemedicine can also function within the organization, not just from a patient-doctor interaction. And we are integrating, as I said, that aspect into our business going forward, very much so.
So, Magda, we're still painfully in the midst of a global pandemic, and we're all hoping that sometime next year the world will come back to something like what we used to call normal. I want to ask you, based on what you know from your business, what you hear from your dozen clinics around Egypt, what you hear from colleagues, what the future of COVID spread and then eventually COVID containment through vaccination or other measures is in Egypt specifically. We talk a lot here in the United States about our situation, but I think our viewers everywhere would love to hear your sense of what's ahead over the next year in terms of the pandemic in Egypt.
Well, I don't have a magic ball to really know what's coming ahead. I think everybody would love to know. I can only have an intelligent guess. So we have had a very strong first wave in Egypt in March, April, May. By the end of June, it started subsiding. Now we see the numbers rising again. We can feel it definitely in the flow of telemedicine calls and in the suspected cases in our clinics. We don't have very widespread testing in Egypt, and it is a bit expensive to test. So many patients will not be tested, but through a certain protocol of triage, the doctors can very clearly say these are highly suspected cases, and then they will be advised to self-isolate. So I think the majority of the cases in Egypt are not reported, not because of the lack of reporting, but of the limited testing. But there are lots of cases that are self-isolating. From what we see in our clinics and the flow, we are not in a situation that was like last summer. The numbers are rising, but not as fast and not as seriously ill. So the the intensity of the disease in the second wave, at least here in Egypt, is far less as far as we can see, but it's not going to disappear. We are very lucky that our weather allows us to do proper ventilation, so people are now doing a lot of outdoor events, outdoor meetings, even when you are in offices, all the windows are open. Hygiene measures are now becoming part of the day-to-day life. So I think we will learn to live with it, being cautious to an extent that doesn't disrupt life completely, but being careful until, as we're talking, until vaccine distribution is available enough to reach Egypt and to reach the majority of the population, which I personally don't expect that to happen before next summer. So until then, we will just have to coexist with the disease and be as careful as we can, and continue operating.
Thank you. That's a useful summary, and I think the answer for the United States wouldn't be altogether different. By the end of next summer is when we hope to see some fundamental changes. So let me turn to questions from our viewers. I have more than 15. Thanks for sending them in on the Q&A platform. And I'll start with one for Ashraf. Sabry, it's a question, I won't identify the questioners by name, but it's a good one. How have the lives of everyday Egyptians concretely changed as a result of the financial services you're offering?
Well, I mean, you know, the adoption of the service reflects the value created to the end. Tremendously. We grow in terms of number of transactions by 50% year over year. So the reality is, on different services, we are actually witnessing different values. So for normal consumers, we are creating convenience. For small businesses, we are generating more income, helping them to grow their business. For enterprises, we are creating a more efficient payment ecosystem for them to realize their money. So I think for banks, we are helping them to extend their services in a commercially sustainable model to the unbanked through a very wide dispersed digital network. So I think, I mean, looking at the different stakeholders, the evolution of the service and the growth and the increase of adoption reflects the value creation to the different stakeholders.
So I have a question here for Magda, this comes from Ahmed Youssef, and Ahmed asks, will there be upcoming investments in the area of digital health and healthcare information technology? And it's a question I was thinking of as you were discussing the future, Magda. This space is just going to grow very quickly. One thing we say about the post-pandemic world is it's just going to be different. The demands that we've developed for services, the ways we found of working and living, some of them may persist. What about the new investments in some of these digital health and healthcare sectors?
I mean, in terms of Egypt as a whole, there's definitely a lot of activity happening in that space. We see, I mean, we get approached by many new startups in the health tech space all the time. And like any startup scene, some of them will succeed, some of them will not succeed. The market will clear itself out within the next couple of years. And as I said, for us in Dawi, we are definitely integrating a lot of technology aspects into our day-to-day operations. To start with, the basic data capture of having all the health data completely digitized in terms of ICD-10 diagnoses and everything that is really researchable data is a very important aspect, because on top of that, you can capitalize these things by having intelligent diagnostics and intelligent decision support tools for the physicians, for example. So that is an aspect that is definitely coming into play with all the new guidelines and all the new things that are coming up. The doctors can't keep up with the information, and having intelligent tools built into your day-to-day workflow will help the physicians tremendously. So that is an aspect that we are already doing. And then the aspect of patient empowerment, where a lot of the data is accessible to the patients. They are part of the decision making by using their mobile apps or having web access to their profiles. This is also something that is not very available in Egypt because it's a layered approach. You have to have the data, and then you have to have the physician access tools that are intelligent enough, and then the patient engagement tools. And on top of all of that, you can have a telemedicine layer. And if you think of it in terms of a stack of technology that you can combine, then yes, of course, there is a lot of opportunities for investment in the different building blocks of that ecosystem of health tech.
So I have a question for Ashraf from Brahim Hassan. Again, it's one that I was thinking about as you were talking about your success in Egypt. And the question is simple. What's Fawry's expansion plan outside of Egypt?
Well, we have, because we have developed our technology, so our expansion plan is really leveraging our technology to go outside Egypt. So our plan is not to replicate Fawry or an as-is model of what happened in Egypt, but to partner with other service providers in different countries to leverage the technology that have been developed with Fawry, to leverage the experience and the management of providing such services. We started that actually in the UAE, and we have a lot of potential opportunities in the pipeline in discussions. But our main focus is how we can leverage the technology and leverage the experience in other markets rather than inventing, or going and make a full operation in those markets. And we think this model is efficient, quick, can accelerate the growth, and can create value to all stakeholders.
So if I understand you, Ashraf, the idea is that more that you'd partner in these other markets than that you'd take your own name and platform in as an independent provider.
Yeah, this is exactly, this is the experience that we are actually launching in UAE. We are expecting this to happen very soon. And as I was saying, we are discussing several opportunities of different portions. E-commerce is becoming very important in other markets. Benefits and loyalty platforms are important. Mobile platform is important. Digital lending and digital scoring is important. So this entire platform is available for multiple even service providers outside the country. And we have lots of international remittances, lots of discussions actually that is happening.
I've lost Ashraf there, so I'm going to turn to Magda with a question about your future growth in Dawi clinics, Magda. And our questioner asks whether you are planning to expand into the Alexandria area more, and more generally, whether you envision really a nationwide company across Egypt. Will you have Dawi clinics in Upper Egypt? Just how broad do you see your market impact being?
Well, I'll go back to the Starbucks similarity, and I would like to be as widespread as Starbucks is. So our target is definitely to reach all the urban centers around Egypt. We have, as I said, last year gone to Tanta and Mansoura, which are two major urban cities in the Delta. Alexandria is definitely on top of our priorities. But we approach our geographical rollout in terms of a cluster. So we like to have a few clinics that are geographically close to each other so that we can manage them from an administrative and supervisory level as a cluster. So we roll out cluster by cluster. We have started with East Delta. We're going to move to West Delta, and yes, definitely Upper Egypt and Canal Zone as well. So our plan, and our current rollout plan, is to reach 50 clinics distributed throughout Egypt in the next 2-3 years.
And I have a final question for Ashraf. This is from Sharif Abu El-Allah. Forgive me if I mispronounced that, but the question is about your plans, if any, to really take a stronger role in e-commerce. Specifically, the question is about whether you want to take your e-commerce platform into the pharmaceutical sector, What about that specifically, and then more broadly, your future in e-commerce?
Yeah, absolutely. We are investing a lot in e-commerce, facilitating e-commerce, whether through digital presence and we have, or through facilitating payment. And on our list, we have probably something near to 3,000 e-commerce players or 4,000 e-commerce players that are using our facilities. Regarding pharmaceutical to us is as other e-commerce platforms, which is digitizing a special service and availing it to the consumer through the platform. And definitely pharmaceutical is important. And we are not working on any of them right now, but I can say that we are working in the tourism, in the government services, in the retail stores, in the media and entertainment, all of those in this actually are being offered through the Fawry platform. So e-commerce is very strategic and very important to the future.
So we have had a wonderful opportunity to hear from two people who are building very dynamic businesses. I thank all the people who sent in questions. There were 25 or more. I apologize to those I wasn't able to pose to Ashraf and Magda. But let me thank you for being with us. And I now want to turn to Jim Harmon for some closing comments in our last 10 minutes about this Egyptian American Enterprise Fund experience and what the lessons are for other places. Jim, those are wonderful stories. As I said at the outset, there are many issues to think about with Egypt involving politics or a range of issues. But in terms of economic development, we heard some pretty startling stories. Let me ask you the kind of start-off question that I've heard people raise about enterprise funds, and this one in particular, which is whether they, in reaching out to the sort of dynamic tech-connected sector, they reach deeply enough into societies, into frontier markets in terms of penetration. What's your feeling about that?
David, firstly, what we learned early on was that we couldn't put Americans on the ground and expect that they would be able to reach a vast number of any of these businesses, tech and all. So early on in our first trip, I recognized that we had to Egyptianize this, and that means reach platforms that could reach hundreds, if not thousands, of potential businesses and at a new early stage. So we had to find people who were very good at, who knew the technology well, knew the state of Egypt very well. And there we were very fortunate that we found several platforms that could reach out. So I have no doubt that part of it was all the years that that I spent in the frontier world, but most of it was fortunate that we were able to reach the right people in Cairo early who could show us the platform that they had in order to reach a vast amount of Egyptian startups.
Jim, you, from early on, I remember in our conversations, you talked about the importance of helping to generate local Egyptian private equity partners. You had a partner early on, Lorax Capital, if I remember correctly, that was important to you in trying to seed this ecosystem, if you will. To talk about that and about what changes you've seen in the private equity and just generally the financial sector in Egypt since you first got involved.
Well, I think first, as you know, when we arrived, it was fairly chaotic because they had a lot of protests. In 2011 and 2012 were particularly difficult years. No one was investing in Egypt at the time. Currency was under pressure. They had yet to agree with the IMF. It was an extremely difficult time. No enterprise fund had ever been formed before to help the private sector during, quote, a revolution that was going on. I knew right away we had to find the right people to help us who were Egyptian, who were based in Cairo, and who knew how we could find the right investments that would make a difference from a development point of view and where we wouldn't lose money. And so we on one particular trip, I interviewed 20 very, very good corporate finance people who came out of the best investment banking firms, many of which had been trained in the United States and the United Kingdom, and they were very good. Eventually, through one source, I met someone who was willing to start a private equity business. There was no activity in the private equity business at that time. It would be as if you were going to a country, starting everything all over again, except that we had 100 million people, and we had a fairly intelligent community. Now we just had to provide the funds that could allow them to find the investments, as I said, where we wouldn't lose any money, but where we actually could make a difference. And there we found some very talented Egyptians. So it's not only the first firm that you've mentioned, it's a number of others that we have now, we have seeded and we will see. We have, if there's anything I'm very proud of, is we've helped to recreate the private equity environment in Egypt. I expect there to be a number of private equity firms all doing much of that. They bring in foreign capital, which is very important to Egypt. Plus they are moving the early stage companies to the next level of funding. And then they're going public, as we've seen has happened with Fawry, and as we've seen what happened to our second investment, which is a finance business called Sarwa. So the startup key was to find the right people who could help us build or use the platform to reach a number of the talented early stage businesses that we could finance.
Jim, let me ask you about a complicated part of this story, and that's dealing with the Egyptian government. Your contacts with the government began back in the days of President Mohamed Morsi, after the Tahrir Square events and the departure of President Mubarak. They've continued with the government of President Sisi. Talk a little bit about your dealings with the government's desire to have a role in the enterprise fund, your sense of what's appropriate and manageable and what isn't in that regard, and if you've had conversations with President Sisi about this role that the fund plays in its future. I'm sure our viewers would love to hear about that.
So I've met now with three, in the 9 years, I've met with three presidents of Egypt. I have met with President Sisi 4 or 5, maybe more times. Of course, President Sisi is anxious to continue to see foreign direct investment come into Egypt. So the Enterprise Fund represented a catalyst for attracting other investing institutions to come in. On the very first deal that we did with Fawry, we were able to bring in a British investment firm that had not invested in Egypt before. We were able to bring in a major African private equity firm called Helios, which came in, became our partners in it. So bringing in this capital made certainly President Sisi and the others in the government quite pleased. I would say at the very beginning, the viewers, everybody thought they could run the Enterprise Fund, starting with our own government, where USAID and State Department thought that they should be running it. Why shouldn't the government run it? Why do we need the private sector or Jim Harmon or anybody like that to help us run this business? We can invest the money there. Secondly, the Egyptian government itself thought the same thing. Why do we need you to come in here now? We can just give us the 300 million and we'll invest it. Probably the fastest way for us to lose that money would have been to use either government to invest the money. I think the private sector has had experience in investing the money. But I did have to listen to some forceful statements made on both sides as to why should we use the private sector in doing that. I think the private sector relationship to an enterprise fund is critical. It's the only way we're going to bring in the kind of technology and expertise to be successful. But I had many meetings, but mostly they were supportive. The Egyptian government supported us because they saw us bringing capital into Egypt. In addition, some of it was some technical expertise that American companies could bring in and could help.
So a final question, Jim, and then we've come almost to the end of our hour. I know you are a believer that whatever political issues there may be between governments, it's important to have some continuity of the U.S. investment and economic development presence. Maybe you could talk about that briefly. And then finally, what thoughts you have for the new administration of President-elect Biden as he thinks about frontier markets and effective ways of getting America involved. Should he pay attention to this enterprise fund story that we've been talking about today?
So, very important part of the message. I think enterprise funds are a very important potential vehicle to help grow the economies, the private sector in the frontier and developing world. Our success in Egypt is not just noted by how much money we may have made, or even on our development report, how many jobs we've created, or how much better gender balance we've done. I think we were able to jumpstart the private sector during a very difficult period of time. That could be done in a number of other parts of the world. So if we had been more active, possibly with an enterprise fund in Central America, maybe we could have created enough jobs that wouldn't have been the migration rush to come into the United States. If it had been done in sub-Saharan Africa in a different way, I think, and if we found Africans to run it, I believe very much it would have helped those countries to grow. I think you could apply what we've done in Egypt to a number of parts of the world. So it's my highest recommendation, probably after all the years I've spent in the private sector and in the government, to the new administration, that they take a close look, and I know they are, at what we've done in Egypt. The key difference, I often say, between the 1990s when they started enterprise funds and today is related to three areas. One, there is now human capital in much of the frontier world, especially in Egypt, but also everywhere. They are professionals who have worked in all sorts of investment banking firms in the United States or in the United Kingdom. So there's human capital available to make the decisions to invest the funds. Secondly, there's technology everywhere. So the Fawry story is an example of that. You could be doing a Fawry in many other of the frontier countries. And the third thing is capital flows. Capital flows are now moving all over. So between capital coming into the frontier and the developing world and technology available and human capital, we should be promoting more enterprise funds all over the frontier developing world. A very important development occurred while I was 4 years ago. We were still in the midst of early stage investing. We were approached by a major impact investing fund in California who had decided that enterprise funds were the ultimate impact business. And they would like to partner with the United States government in future enterprise funds. That was a critical turning point. I'd never heard from the private sector, even though I knew most of these fund managers, that they were interested in doing that. And they set up meetings with a number of investment impact funds for us to discuss how they could do future enterprise funds. So what do I think, and what do I hope? The United States government will consider, without a lot of funding from Congress, we do not need a lot of funds out of the taxpayer. We need the oversight and some of this guidance of the US government. A significant amount of private funding would join with the public sector to do enterprise funds all over the world. From my point of view, I hope a number of other countries copy us. I hope the Germans copy us. I hope the Chinese do the same. If we all were doing this for the frontier world, can you imagine the impact on poverty? Can you imagine the progress that we've made, the job creation we could do? So it's a vehicle that has enormous potential, a partnership between the private and public sector where it doesn't cost anything because we've shown that you could make a profit. So I'm quite a big believer in this concept of a public partnership for growing the private sector in much of the developing and frontier world. I think that may be the most important lesson we've learned. Now, Egypt was a very good model to take because there was a lot of talent there who had already learned from prior years, but we could do the same thing in lots of other parts of the world.
So I want to thank Jim Harmon for those concluding comments, the clarity with which you made your case, Jim. And I want to thank our panelists, Ashraf, Sabry, and Magda Habib, for explaining the businesses that they have built, are continuing to build, Fawry and Dawi clinics, and to thank all of you for spending the last hour with us, thinking about the experience of the Egyptian American Enterprise Fund and the businesses that it's funded. I'm David Ignatius. It was my pleasure to moderate this, and with that, I'll say goodbye to our audience.
Thank you, David.